The manila folder sat on Captain Victoria Lawson's desk for 11 minutes before she opened it. She'd heard about the case already. Everyone at Fort Bragg had. A night convoy exercise gone wrong on Highway 24. A HMMWV rolled twice off the shoulder. 2 soldiers dead before the medevac even lifted off. The driver, a 22-year-old specialist named Daniel Reyes, was already being talked about in the DFAC and the motor pool like his guilt was settled fact. Kid panicked. Kid was going too fast. Kid should have never been behind the wheel that night. Victoria had been in the JAG Corps for 9 years. She knew what it meant when a case arrived on her desk already wearing a verdict. She opened the folder. The incident report was thin. Thinner than she expected for 2 deaths. Sworn statements from 3 surviving passengers, a preliminary MP write-up, a vehicle inspection form stamped cleared for operation 4 days before the exercise. Standard, clean. The kind of file that made a defense attorney's job simple because there was nothing to argue with. That was what bothered her. She'd spent almost a decade reading incident reports, and the honest ones were never this tidy. Real accidents left messy paper trails, conflicting timestamps, handwritten corrections, someone's initials scratched out and redone. This one read like it had been assembled by someone more interested in closing the file than telling the truth of what happened on that road. She flipped to the last page and found Reyes's booking photo. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a kid who hadn't slept in 3 weeks. They brought him into the small consultation room at 1400 hours, and Victoria watched him carefully as he sat down across from her. Reyes kept his hands flat on the table, like he was trying to prove they weren't shaking, even though they were. "Captain Lawson," she said, extending her hand. "I've been assigned as your defense counsel." He shook it without much strength behind it. "Everybody already knows what happened, ma'am. I don't know what there is to defend." "Tell me anyway." He was quiet for a moment, staring at the table like the wood grain might give him permission to speak. "We left the motor pool at 2140. Standard night convoy, 3 vehicles. I was driving lead. Maybe 4 miles out. The wheel." He stopped, shook his head. "It didn't feel right. Before we even left. I told my TC something felt off with the steering, and he told me the vehicle was cleared. We didn't have time to swap it out. We had a timeline to hit." "Who was your TC?" "Sergeant Halloway." He looked up at her for the first time. "I'm not saying it to blame him. I'm saying it because it's true. Something was wrong with that truck before we ever turned the ignition." Victoria kept her face even, the way she'd trained herself to over 9 years of hearing soldiers swear to things that sometimes turned out to be fear-talking, and sometimes turned out to be the only honest thing anyone in the chain of command would say. She couldn't tell yet which this was. "The report says the vehicle was inspected and cleared 4 days before the exercise," she said. "Then somebody's lying, ma'am, because it wasn't right. I felt it in the wheel before we hit 40 miles an hour." She wrote nothing down. Not yet. She'd learned that soldiers talked more freely when they didn't feel like every word was being filed against them. "I'm not going to promise you anything today," she told him before she left. "But I am going to read every page of this file. All of it. Twice." He didn't answer. He just nodded, the way a man nods when he's stopped expecting anyone to actually mean what they say. Back in her office that night, Victoria laid the incident report across her desk next to the vehicle maintenance log, working through both under the flat hum of the overhead light. Everyone else on the floor had gone home. She liked working after hours. No one interrupting, no one watching what she flagged. It was nearly 2200 when she found it. The vehicle inspection form listed a clearance date of the 14th, signed off by a maintenance NCO. But the dispatch log, the record of which vehicles left the motor pool and when, showed that same HMMWV checked out for a separate exercise on the 13th, the day before it was supposedly inspected and cleared. A truck can't be cleared for service after it's already been driven. Victoria sat back in her chair and read the 2 lines again, certain she'd misunderstood something simple. She hadn't. Someone had either made a clerical error, or someone had signed off on a form for a vehicle they never actually looked at. It wasn't proof of anything. Not yet. A single date discrepancy in a stack of paperwork wasn't going to overturn a case the entire base had already decided. But it was a thread, and Victoria Lawson had never in her career been able to leave a thread alone once she'd found one. She pulled a legal pad toward her and began writing a timeline, not of the accident, but of everything that had happened to that vehicle in the 2 weeks before it rolled off Highway 24 and killed 2 soldiers. She had a feeling it was going to be a long night. Victoria hadn't planned on becoming a defense attorney. She'd grown up on army posts her whole life, moving every 2 or 3 years, learning to make friends fast because she'd be losing them fast too. Her father had been a career NCO, 22 years in, the kind of soldier who never complained and never asked for anything he hadn't earned. When a training injury tore up his shoulder in his 19th year, she'd watched the Army process him like paperwork. A medical board that took 11 months, a disability rating that didn't match what the doctors had actually told him, a retirement ceremony nobody above battalion level bothered to attend. He never said a bad word about the Army. Not once, not to her, not to anyone. But Victoria had been 19 years old, in her first year of college, and she'd watched something in her father go quiet that never fully came back. She'd gone to law school with a plan already forming, not to fight the Army. She loved the Army, in the complicated way you love something that raised you and disappointed you in equal measure. She'd gone to law school because she'd decided somebody needed to make sure the system did right by the people who wore the uniform, even when, especially when, the system found it inconvenient. 9 years in, she still believed that. Some days it was harder than others. The accident site was 40 minutes off base, a stretch of Highway 24 with a wide gravel shoulder and a guardrail that had been replaced. She noted the newer, unweathered metal. Sometime in the last month. She stood where the report said the vehicle had first lost control, feeling the slope of the road under her boots, trying to understand what it would feel like to be behind a wheel that wasn't responding the way it should at 40 miles an hour in the dark. She interviewed the 2 surviving passengers separately that afternoon. Both gave careful, measured answers. Reyes had been driving normally. Nothing seemed unusual before the vehicle drifted. It happened fast. Nobody had time to react. The answers were almost identical in phrasing. Not word for word. Nothing so obvious as that. But close enough that Victoria found herself wondering whether these 2 soldiers had been coached or had simply spent 3 weeks telling the same story to each other until it hardened into the only version either of them could remember. She didn't push. Not yet. Pushing too early taught witnesses what you were looking for. Major Ellis Dunbar caught her in the JAG office hallway 2 days later, coffee in hand, his tone friendly in the particular way senior officers used when they wanted to say something without appearing to have said it. "Heard you're spending a lot of hours on the Reyes case." "It's my case, sir." "It's a hard case," he said. "Physical evidence, eyewitnesses, a clean maintenance record. This isn't the one to go looking for angles on, Victoria. Some cases you build a defense. Some cases you help your client accept what's coming with some dignity." "With respect, sir, I haven't finished reading the file." Dunbar studied her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted from friendly to careful. "Just keep in mind whose fitness report you're building while you finish reading it." She thanked him for the coffee talk and went back to her office, and she didn't think about his warning again until that evening, when she submitted a formal request for the complete maintenance history on the HMMWV, not just the inspection form already in the file, but every work order, every parts requisition, every signature going back 3 months. The response came back 2 days later. Records were still being compiled. Victoria had requested maintenance records before, on smaller cases. Nothing this serious. It had never taken longer than a day. Motor pool records were logged digitally now. Still being compiled wasn't an answer. It was a delay dressed up as one. She sat with that phrase for a long time. In 9 years of JAG work, she'd learned that people didn't stall over nothing. They stalled when giving you the real answer meant giving you something they'd rather you didn't have. That night she called Reyes's assigned platoon sergeant, a man named Holloway who'd been the truck commander in the vehicle. The same Holloway Reyes had mentioned. The one he'd told about the steering before they ever left the wire. Holloway's voice on the phone was tight, clipped, a man choosing every word like it might be used against him later. "I don't recall him saying anything about the steering, ma'am." "Nothing at all. He specifically remembers telling you." "I don't recall that, no." She let the silence sit for a second longer than was comfortable, an old trick, waiting to see if anyone would fill it. Holloway didn't. "Thank you for your time, Sergeant." She hung up and stared at her notes. Reyes's version, clear and specific. A wheel that didn't feel right. A comment made before departure. Holloway's version, vague, forgetful, careful. Two accounts of the same conversation, and only one of them sounded like a man protecting himself. Victoria pulled out a fresh legal pad and started a new page. Not a defense strategy yet. Just a question, written at the top in her own handwriting. The kind of question that had gotten her father's shoulder quietly buried in a file 11 years ago, and that she was no longer willing to let happen to anyone else on her watch. Who signed off on a truck nobody actually inspected, and why? She didn't have an answer yet, but she intended to find one, whatever Dunbar's warning was worth. It took Victoria 4 days to track down specialist Alicia Moon. Moon had been the mechanic assigned to the motor pool's maintenance bay at the time of the accident, and according to personnel records, she'd been reassigned to a support unit at Fort Campbell less than a week after the crash. A transfer that fast, for a specialist with no disciplinary issues and 18 months left on her enlistment contract, wasn't unheard of. But it wasn't common either, and Victoria had stopped believing in coincidences somewhere around her 3rd year of practicing law. She reached Moon by phone on a Thursday evening, catching her off shift. There was a long pause after Victoria introduced herself. "I already gave a statement," Moon said carefully. "I've read it. I have some follow-up questions if you're willing." Another pause, longer this time. "I don't know if I should be talking to you, ma'am." "You're allowed to talk to defense counsel specialist. Nobody can stop you from that." Victoria heard something shift in Moon's breathing. Not quite relief, but close to it. Like someone had finally given her permission she'd been waiting for. 3 weeks before the accident, Moon said, "I flagged that vehicle. Steering column had play in it that shouldn't have been there. I wrote it up, sent it up the chain, told my NCOIC it needed a full inspection before it went back into rotation. And what happened? I got told it was handled, that somebody signed off on it." Moon's voice tightened. "But I never touched that truck again after I flagged it. Nobody asked me to fix it. It just disappeared off my list. And then a few weeks later I heard it was cleared and back in the motor pool." "Do you still have a copy of your original write-up?" "I don't know. Maybe. I can look." Victoria thanked her, hung up, and sat in the quiet of her office feeling something she recognized from every case that had ever mattered to her. The sense of a floor opening up beneath a story everyone had already agreed to believe. The maintenance paperwork trail, once Victoria pulled every piece of it instead of just what had been offered to her, told its own story. Moon's original defect report existed, buried under a stack of work orders. A steering system flagged for inspection on the 22nd of the previous month. But the closeout form attached to it, the one certifying the repair had been completed, was dated only 2 days later. 2 days for a full steering system inspection and repair on a vehicle that, according to Moon, nobody had actually touched. Victoria cross-referenced the date against the battalion training calendar and found the piece that made the rest of it make sense. A readiness inspection, scheduled by higher command, was set for the week following that closeout. Vehicle readiness rates were part of what got reported up the chain during those inspections. A truck sitting in the motor pool, awaiting parts, counted against that number. A truck marked cleared and mission ready did not. Somebody had needed a clean number more than they'd needed a working steering column. She drove to see Reyes's mother that weekend, not because it was required, but because she'd learned early in her career that faces mattered, that reading a case only through paperwork let you forget what was actually at stake in it. Carla Reyes lived in a small rented house 40 minutes from base, and she opened the door already braced for bad news The way people get after enough of it. They keep saying he killed those boys, she said, once they were seated at her kitchen table. On the base Facebook page, people who don't even know him. I know, Victoria said. I can't promise you how this ends, but I want you to know I don't believe the story everyone's decided on is the whole truth. Carla's eyes filled, and she pressed her hand flat against the table like she needed something solid to hold on to. He called me the night before it happened, told me he was tired, that they'd been running exercises back to back, that the trucks were beat up. He didn't sound scared of driving. He sounded scared of the equipment. It wasn't evidence. It would never hold up in a courtroom as anything more than hearsay. But it matched everything else Victoria had been finding. One more thread pulling in the same direction. The knock on her office door came the following Monday, and Victoria wasn't entirely surprised to find Major Dunbar standing there again, without his coffee this time, without the friendly tone either. I heard you contacted Specialist Moon, he said. She's a witness. I'm allowed to. I heard you pulled the full maintenance history. I'm allowed to do that too, sir. Dunbar stepped further into her office and lowered his voice, though there was no one else on the floor to hear him. There are people above battalion level watching how this case gets handled, Victoria. This isn't advice anymore. This is me telling you that the road you're walking down has consequences that don't stop at Reyes. Are you telling me to stop investigating, sir? I'm telling you to think very carefully about what you think you're going to find, and whether you're prepared for what happens once you find it. He left without waiting for her answer, and Victoria sat alone in her office for a long time afterward, staring at the growing stack of paper on her desk. Moon's defect report, the impossible 2-day closeout, the readiness inspection date, Reyes's account of a steering wheel that hadn't felt right. She thought about her father's shoulder, and the file that had taken 11 months to close, and the quiet that had settled into him afterward and never fully lifted. Then she picked up her pen and kept writing. By the second week of her investigation, Victoria had built something she hadn't expected to find so cleanly: a name. Lieutenant Colonel Grant Ashford commanded the battalion support operations, and it was his signature, not on the maintenance closeout itself, but on the memo authorizing an expedited readiness push ahead of the division inspection that connected every piece she'd gathered. She found it buried in a routine training folder, the kind of document nobody expected a defense attorney to ever request. 3 pages of guidance directing company commanders to clear their non-mission capable vehicle lists before the inspection date. No specific instruction to falsify anything, nothing so obvious as an order to cut corners. Just pressure, applied from the top down, worded carefully enough that no single sentence in it could be called wrongdoing on its own. But Victoria had read enough Army memos in 9 years to know how pressure like that traveled. It didn't need to say cut corners. It only needed to say get the numbers clean, and let every NCO and mechanic below it figure out how. She sat with the memo for a long time before she let herself believe what it meant. Ashford hadn't rolled that truck off Highway 24. He hadn't been anywhere near it. But the chain that led from his desk to a mechanic told to handle it, to a steering column nobody actually repaired, to 2 dead soldiers and a young specialist facing prison. That chain was real, and it was documented, and it had never once been mentioned in the case against Daniel Reyes. She didn't sleep well that week. Not from doubt about what she'd found. She was more certain of it than she'd been of almost anything in her career. But from what came next. Filing what she had into the court record wasn't just going to complicate the prosecution's case. It was going to name a lieutenant colonel in open court as the source of a decision that had gotten 2 soldiers killed. It was going to make her the officer who dragged the Army's dirty laundry into a courtroom instead of quietly winning a technical acquittal and letting everyone move on. She thought about the plea option more than once. The prosecution had signaled, through informal channels, that they'd accept a reduced charge, dereliction of duty instead of negligent homicide, a few months instead of years, a quiet resolution that would let Reyes rebuild some kind of life without the case ever having to touch anyone above his pay grade. It would be easier. It would almost certainly be safer, for him and for her. Victoria drove out to see Reyes at the confinement facility and laid it out plainly. the way she owed him. "I can push for a plea," she told him. "Dereliction, reduced sentence, this ends in weeks instead of months. Or I can put everything I've found into the trial record, the defect report, the closeout that doesn't add up, the readiness memo. And we go in front of a panel and argue this all the way through. That path is harder. It might not work. And it puts a target on both of us that doesn't come off easy." Reyes was quiet for a long moment, turning the choice over the way a man does when he's been carrying a version of it since the night his friends died. "Everybody already thinks I killed them, ma'am. If I take the plea, that's the story that sticks. Forever. My kids, if I ever have any, that's what they'd find if they looked me up." He looked at her steadily. "I'd rather know the truth got said out loud, even if it costs me. I already lost the 2 guys in that truck. I'm not going to lose the truth about what happened to them too." Victoria nodded slowly. It was the answer she'd hoped for and hadn't wanted to influence him toward. His decision to make, not hers. "Then we go to trial," she said. "And I need you to understand, this isn't going to be easy on either of us." She filed the motion for full disclosure of the maintenance and readiness inspection chain of command the following morning, attaching Moon's original defect report, the 2-day closeout, and Ashford's memo as supporting exhibits. Within hours, her request had been forwarded up channels far faster than any maintenance record request ever had. Dunbar didn't come to warn her again. He didn't need to. The silence from his office said enough. What came instead, 2 days later, was a call from her own detailing officer, a gentle, almost sympathetic suggestion that Victoria consider whether this was truly the case she wanted to make her name on, this early in her career. Nobody threatened her outright. Nobody had to. She understood, the way every officer eventually understands, that some doors close quietly, without ever being slammed. She thought again about her father. 22 years of service, a torn shoulder, and a system that had found it easier to lose his file in process than admit fault. She thought about how much she'd wanted, at 19, for someone to have fought for him the way she was about to fight for Daniel Reyes. She didn't withdraw the motion. The trial opened on a gray Tuesday morning in a courtroom that felt smaller than the weight of what was about to happen inside it. Reyes sat beside her in his dress uniform, jaw tight, hands steady this time. Carla Reyes sat in the gallery, 3 rows back, alone. And near the back, arriving a few minutes after proceedings began, Lieutenant Colonel Grant Ashford took a seat. He hadn't been called yet. He didn't need to be, not for opening statements. But Victoria felt his presence the moment she stood to address the panel, felt the particular attention of a man watching to see exactly how much she actually knew, and how far she was willing to go to say it out loud. "Members of the panel," she began, "the government wants you to believe this case is simple. A driver, a road, a mistake. But I intend to show you that the truth of what happened on Highway 24 began weeks before Specialist Reyes ever got behind that wheel. And it did not begin with him." Somewhere behind her, she heard the faint shift of a chair. She didn't turn around to see who'd moved. Specialist Alicia Moon took the stand on the second day of trial, and Victoria watched the panel's faces as Moon described flagging the steering defect 3 weeks before the accident, the write-up she'd filed, the assurance that it had been handled, the vehicle that returned to rotation without her ever touching it again. The prosecution's cross-examination tried to shake her, suggesting she'd misremembered the timeline, that maintenance logs could be interpreted different ways. Moon didn't waver. She'd spent weeks carrying the weight of what she'd seen and not been able to say. On the stand, she said it plainly, and it held. Then Victoria entered the closeout form into evidence, the repair certified complete just 2 days after the defect was flagged, for work that would have taken a properly staffed bay the better part of a week. She walked the panel through the readiness inspection calendar, the training memo bearing Lieutenant Colonel Ashford's signature, the language about clearing non-mission capable vehicle lists before the division's arrival. She was careful, methodical, never once raising her voice or reaching for a dramatic accusation. She let the documents speak, because documents, unlike people, didn't have a career to protect. When Ashford was finally called, he answered the prosecution's questions smoothly, confidently, a man used to rooms like this one deferring to him. But Victoria's cross-examination didn't ask him to admit wrongdoing. It asked him simple, factual questions he couldn't avoid. Whether he'd issued the readiness memo, whether he understood how non-mission capable vehicles affected the numbers reported to division, whether he'd inquired, at any point, how quickly the flagged vehicles on his battalion's list had actually been repaired. He hadn't. He said so, under oath, in a courtroom with Reyes's mother sitting 3 rows back. It wasn't a confession. Ashford never said he'd caused the accident, because in the narrowest legal sense, he hadn't. But the panel didn't need a confession. They needed to understand that a chain of pressure had run from his desk down to a steering column that was never actually repaired, and that Daniel Reyes had climbed into that truck trusting a system that had already failed him before he ever turned the key. The panel deliberated for 6 hours. Victoria sat with Reyes in the small room outside the courtroom, neither of them saying much. He kept his hands flat on the table, the same way he had the first day she'd met him, except now they weren't shaking. "Whatever happens," he said eventually, "thank you for actually reading the file twice." She almost smiled. "I told you I would." When the panel returned, the courtroom felt very quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet before something that matters gets said. Not the dramatic silence of a movie, just the ordinary stillness of people who understood the next few words would follow Daniel Reyes for the rest of his life. Not guilty, on the charge of negligent homicide. Carla Reyes made a small sound in the gallery, her hand pressed against her mouth. Reyes himself didn't move for a moment, like he needed to hear it a second time before it became real. Victoria felt the release in her own chest that she hadn't let herself feel until that exact second. 9 days of trial, weeks of investigation, months of a case she could have walked away from at any point along the way. There was no medal for what Victoria had done. No ceremony, no commendation, nothing that would show up in a personnel file the way the case against Ashford's judgment eventually would, once an inspector general's inquiry opened in the weeks that followed. Some officers in her building stopped making easy conversation with her in the hallway. A few, quietly, in the kind of low voice people used when they didn't want to be overheard agreeing with something inconvenient, told her she'd done the right thing. She thought that was probably as close to recognition as this particular kind of work ever got. Outside the courthouse, in the thin afternoon light, Victoria watched Daniel Reyes walk down the front steps in his dress uniform and fold into his mother's arms. Carla held onto him the way a person holds onto something they genuinely believed they might lose. Reyes didn't look like a man who'd been vindicated so much as a man who'd finally been allowed to grieve 2 friends without also carrying the blame for their deaths. That was its own kind of justice, Victoria thought. Not the clean kind from the stories people told about the military. Not medals, not parades, not villains clearly punished and heroes clearly rewarded. Just a truth, finally said out loud in a room with the authority to make it matter, and a young man walking away carrying only the weight that was actually his to carry. She thought about her father again, the way she always seemed to at the end of a case like this. 22 years of service and a file that had taken 11 months to close, quietly, without anyone ever having to admit what it had cost him. She couldn't fix that. It was too late for that. But somewhere on a report buried in an army filing system, Specialist Daniel Reyes's record would now read the truth, instead of a story built to close a file quickly. For Victoria Lawson, that was worth every door that had quietly stopped opening for her. She got in her car and drove back to an office that was, for once, not waiting on her with another file nobody wanted her to read too closely. And that's the story of Captain Victoria Lawson. A woman who read a file twice when everyone else had already closed it and paid a price for it that no medal ever covered. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next story.